what you need to know before we start, and before you start creating the LUTs, which tools are we using mostly for creating the LUTs, and these are adjustment layers. Adjustment layers is something that you're going to use no matter if you're going to create the LUTs responsible for contrast, colors, or the total LUTs where you work with contrast and colors all together. Even for black and white LUTs and everything, you want to know how to work with adjustment layers. So if you just work with open Photoshop as it started, you have adjustments on the right hand side over here. If you don't see it, you can just hit this small arrow over here and reset essentials, or you can hit this small icon on the bottom and all of the adjustments are here. So I'm not going to tell you specifically about each adjustment layer. I believe most of you coming here have slightly some knowledge about Photoshop, and it would take us a lot of time. But what's important for me, I still want to talk a few minutes about adjustment layers. In the next lessons, we're going to work with them. So even you don't feel fully comfortable with them, you will see the process I'm doing, and I will explain you what this certain adjustment that I'm using doing to the image. But let's have a quick walkthrough. We can split the adjustment layers into two categories. One are responsible for shadows, highlights, contrast, and brightness, so everything about the lights. And the other adjustment layers are all about the colors. So for example, the adjustment layers responsible for lights will be brightness, contrast, levels, curves, and exposure. And the adjustment layers responsible for colors will be mostly everything else. So it could be selective color, gradient map, color balance, filter, black and white, of course, hue saturation, vibrance, solid color. Of course, there's few differences, because if you use solid color, if you use gradient map, you need to also work more with the blending modes over here. But if you use color balance, which is my favorite adjustment layer, that should be quite easy. So let's talk about color balance, for example. That's a great tool because it allows you to work selectively with shadows, midtones, and highlights. So I could, let's say I want to have warm shadows. So I would add some of the red to the shadows and a little bit of yellows. And I want to have colder highlights, then I would switch to highlights and apply some cyan and blue over here. As you can see, very simple color effect apply, and that's it. Not something complicated, not something really great to explore if you don't want to affect the lights, because also what you need to know, if you work, whether you work with colors or with lights, if you work with lights, you might affect the saturation values. If you work with the colors, you might affect the luminosity values. So if you want to avoid this, always change blending mode to color. But it's also not always necessary. So this is the tool for sure we're going to use for creating our LUTs. Of course, we will work with hue saturation. It allows you to desaturate the image, change the hue a little bit, but also mainly we're going to work in probably camera raw with this tool. And you have other tools like gradient map, which I mentioned to you requires a little bit more work because we'll have to use blending mode. So for example, if we want to use still warm colors for the shadows as before, and something colder for the highlights, it doesn't look well now. But if we change blending mode to soft light, it already getting some interesting look. We maybe want to work a little bit more with opacity to adjust this. So as you can see, different tools allowing you to do different things. When it's about the lights and shadows, levels would be something that we use a lot, allows you to do a lot. As you can see, you can darken the shadows, you can brighten the highlights, manipulate with midtones, or cut out some darks and whites to create matte effect. And then if you don't want to affect the color values, of course, we'll change blending mode to luminosity, which doesn't make a big difference at the moment. I even couldn't notice this. But as you can see, adjustment layers are something we need to use all the time for creating effect. That's why it's important for you to have a look into them, because for creating LUTs, you will be using them all the time.